Our distinguished speaker is ready to share with us his views on setting the scene CLMVT Strategy. So please warmly welcome Mr. Aditya Srinath, Associate Director of Asia ex-Japan Equity Research, JB Morgan, Securities Singapore Private Limited. A big round of applause, please.
When I signed up for this, they did not tell me I would be going just after the Prime Minister. Yes. So I think you'll find this a little more dry than the speech you've just heard. But to start with, thank you for the opportunity. I am indeed privileged to stand before such an august audience. And what I'm going to do over the next several minutes is walk you through a little bit of a story of not talking about trade wars, but the impact, what's happened because of the trade wars, and what the opportunity for the region, the entire CLMVT region is. To start with, ladies and gentlemen, I'd say that I think we're actually standing at a unique moment for this region. This is the cusp of an economic opportunity that perhaps comes once in 20 years. Why do I say once in 20 years is the first question? Because I actually think that the last time we've had an event such like this, it was 11th December 2011 when China actually signed its ascension to the World Trade Organization, the WTO. That moment over the next decade reshaped and changed the center of balance of entire manufacturing and change over the world. Okay. So China ascended to the WTO in end of 2001. By 2007, China was the single largest trading partner of imports by to the United States of America. So within 5 years, it actually became the single largest trading partner to the United States, and it held that position all the way through to 2018. That, for various reasons, has changed. In the first quarter of this year, China is no longer the US's largest trading partner. The first quarter of this year, it slipped. In fact, way back in 2007, it actually overtook Canada. Canada also is struggling with issues related to NAFTA and so on. What we've seen now is that the EU, as a single bloc, has actually overtaken China as the single largest trading partner. Now, let me find out where this is pointing. I have no idea where it's pointing. Anyway, this trigger for this happening, of course, has been tariffs at this time. But the change is meaningful because what tariffs has done is they've reshaped and changed the path that goods and services are taking across the world. And once these change, you can't go and hit a reset button. So, for the first time in 15 years, countries, companies, supply chains are needing to figure out new pathways for goods and services to reach the hands of consumers, stores, and businesses. Because consumer stores and businesses don't know tariffs. They want a product where they need to have a product in stores in front of them, in computers in front of them. And this process is opening up new opportunities of a kind we haven't seen since the global financial crisis. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is why I actually call this a once-in-20-year opportunity that's sitting before these countries to actually take advantage of the reshaping of trade flows. Now, if we for a minute think about there is something like 600-odd billion of goods going from China. What are these goods? I think it's worth talking about what these goods are. The vast majority, a third of them, is computers and electronics. Electronics of a kind that you and I, all of us have, it's largely smartphones. Okay? I think this slide is important not to tell us, the opportunity for CLMVT is vast. We can talk about agriculture, we can talk. But when we go down to talking about a hub of value chains have to be from chains that are already pre-existing, and we're trying to reshape them. So over the next couple of slides, of the 600-odd billion, consumer electronics is about 200 billion. It's meaningful and high value addition. Once you go beyond that, you can go to electrical equipment, it gets reasonably spread out. But I think from where we stand, we're going to dive a little bit into consumer electronics because I think that's the most important opportunity for the CLMVT region. So, two things we saw. The largest thing, the largest set of goods that go into the US from China are electronics and related equipment. China was the largest single trade partner for over 10, 12 years, and it's now dipped into second. Now that China has gone down, who is benefiting? If we look at this, we'll see that trade to China is down. EU is up. We already saw that. But the first thing to note is that ASEAN already is a winner here. Okay? So two things that we can point out about ASEAN here. One is that ASEAN has gained in the market share loss from China. That's number one. That's right here, if you can see this. The second is that the benefit that ASEAN is seeing is in products that are actually not under tariffs at this time. So if you look at this chart, the yellow part of the bar is products that are currently affected by tariffs. The blue part of the bar is product not affected by tariffs yet. So you do see a benefit that Taiwan and Korea are seeing, but that's a straight swap. They were products that were coming out of China. They've got hit by tariffs, and instead, I try to get them through Korea and Taiwan. In ASEAN's case, people are actually figuring out that this is not about tariffs. If I have to move my production, where should I move it? ASEAN seems to be benefiting. So one, this is positive because it's not about tariffs. It's probably about competitiveness and about value chains. Two, maybe we should pause a moment here and think about, if ASEAN is benefiting today, do we have a risk tomorrow if there are tariffs on the rest of the products? I think that's worth thinking about. So we should actually take a moment and dig into it. But if we go into this further, you'll see that most of these, consumer electronics, Taiwan, and Korea, let's actually see what goes into the US when we talk about it. Okay? This is a picture of an iPhone that someone smashed to the ground and opened up. Okay? The reason I've put here is to give you a little flavor of what goes into an iPhone, but most importantly, what are the companies that actually supply this? Okay? We don't have to go through all of it, and I apologize if it's not very clear at the back of the room. But we'll start here. The most important thing here is going to be the processor. The processor foundry comes from a company called TSMC in Taiwan. And as we move around this, you will see names like AAC. You will see names like Merry Electronics. These are all companies based in Taiwan. I don't want to be talking about the individual companies, but these are all companies in Taiwan. Once you get to the display, these are about companies based in Korea. So basically what you have is Taiwanese and Korean companies, as well as foundries, which are Taiwanese companies, making the brains of the iPhone. But is the technology from these countries? No. The processors and so on are actually made using technology that comes from the US companies too. Right? It's not only these companies. So what becomes important, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, is that as a tariff war moves over to become a technology rift, and we heard what Professor Kishore Mahbubani said last night, this is something that's going to play out in phases. As it moves from a trade war to a technology rift, protection of technology is going to be important. So if someone is going to be thinking about where they are moving their supply chain, it used to be about where can they make it cheap? Where do you have a good pull? Today, it's who's going to be protecting my own intellectual property in this. Okay? But in saying that, I think I'm actually going to, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm actually going to come back to this a little bit forward. But let me stop at this moment to say that if we look at this, I pointed out that an iPhone has a lot of Taiwanese companies who are benefiting from this. Second, we noticed that China exports to the US has come down. Other than ASEAN, Taiwan has gone up. So let's take a little bit of a case study of Taiwan and see what I believe is the paradox where you can lose even if you win. This chart is exports from Taiwan to different destinations. What does this tell us? What does this tell us? Quite obviously, exports from Taiwan to China and Hong Kong have come down for a period of time. But over the last 12 months, in fact, even before tariffs hit, what you can clearly see is exports from Taiwan to the United States have gone up. In the first 4 or 5 months of the year, exports from Taiwan to the United States are up 21% year on year. It's the fastest they have been for the last 8 years. So something good is going on. So shouldn't Taiwan and Taiwanese companies be happy that there's a trade war? Aren't they benefiting overall? Nope. You can win, but you still lose. The point that this chart tells you is that as you look down here, total exports from Taiwan to the whole world are down 4% year on year in the first 4 months of this year. Right? Exports to the US is up, but what's happening is the compensation from other countries is not sufficient. So, one point to make here, perhaps using the case of Taiwan, is to say that A, you do need to find other markets to compensate. There is a pain factor here. Second, if I was a Taiwanese company, if I were the Taiwanese government, I would be looking immediately at other places to make strategic decisions on where to source and how to source, because even though I'm doing well now, I'm down 4%. Right? And this, I think, is where ASEAN CLMVT comes in. But in order to figure out what they can source from where, if I was someone thinking about my supply chain, let's go down and look at how much of the supply chain goes to the USA and how much comes from China. That probably gives us a good inclination. I hope you can see this at the back, but basically what we have done, our research teams have done, is broken out various consumer electronics and computer products and broken it in terms of how much of demand. The blue line tells you how much of demand is the US. So for server motherboards, it's about 40%. For an iPhone, it's about 33%. And as you go along, how much is from the US? And more importantly, the gray bar here tells you how much of production is outside China, right? And if it was a server motherboard, very, very, very little is outside China. It's 10% that's outside China. Now, the message for a Taiwanese producer who's sending it to the US and producing for China is that he wants to relocate, right? But however, if there is one winning strategy, the winning strategy is apparent here. I want to take you all the way to the right, right? If you look at a smartphone that came from Samsung, unlike the iPhone, only 20% goes into the US. That's good. Of course, you'd want to sell more in the US. But 100% of production is outside China. If there was a winning strategy, it was that. Not that they designed it that way. There was a winning strategy. It was absolutely that. And if we had to take I'm sure nobody needs to take a guess of where a Samsung telephone is largely produced. This is a success story of ASEAN. Right? So if I was sitting in Taiwan and I was looking in this and wondering where I needed to go, I looked at the chart and saw that someone was producing 100% of a smartphone outside of China. It was in ASEAN. If I was going to figure out where I needed to make a visit, to think about where I should be moving my production location, that's where I would be going. So the point I'm trying to make here is that ASEAN is already on the map. It's not like 10 years back that you had to go and convince people that you had to come and make a visit to the region. There is a success story right here. The success story is right in front of us in this region in Vietnam. Right. So if you actually look of the share of US imports, we saw this on an ASEAN basis, you'll see that Thailand has benefited. The net proportion of exports to the US on products going out of ASEAN, Thailand's gone up, Singapore's gone up a little. They do make semiconductors, but the big winner is Vietnam. And if someone was actually looking at a template to take from ASEAN and move it to other countries, it's right here. And as we go along, I think this is a successful template that other countries in the CLMVT region should be looking to emulate. Okay? So we're going to do two things now and see what the benefits here and whether there's a case for people to emulate or whether it's going to be a case of Vietnam, Vietnam, Vietnam. Okay? Let's take a second and find out where this benefit is coming from Vietnam. Okay? If you look at what's going on in Vietnam, exports are up from Vietnam out. Basically, there are two things that are happening here. One, exports to the United States are going up. Simple. We saw that should be self-explanatory. Second, exports to China are coming down. So what's probably happening here is some products that were originally exported for final finishing or final processing to China are instead going out of Vietnam. You already had a supply chain that was largely exposed to Vietnam. You're adding additional facilities there, which is easier to do than starting from scratch. So, one, exports to the US going up, exports to China coming down. Next, let's take a look at investments into Vietnam. FDI into Vietnam has been very, 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 very strong. I think in Asia, there are two countries that stand out when you think about FDI. Foreign direct investments into both India and, importantly, Vietnam have doubled in the last 5 years. They've grown at about an average rate of 14 to 15%. But this year, what you're seeing is that's accelerated even further. FDI into Vietnam is up 16% year on year, but FDI coming from China into Vietnam is up 34%. Right? So if I take these two charts together, what this is telling us is basically that producers have had a supply chain in Vietnam. They have an issue exporting to the US. But you're seeing instead Chinese manufacturers invest in Vietnam and do additional or final processing in Vietnam, investments in that. That's a winning formula. Now, question is, will this trend continue? And will this trend continue to be concentrated in Vietnam? What's the opportunity for other countries? And then what do other countries, as policymakers, think about needing to do in order to benefit from this longer-term trend? It's clear that Vietnam's already the winner in the CLMVT region, or indeed in the world. The question is, how do we take that playbook and take it forward from here? So what the JP Morgan research team did is that we looked at filings, transcripts, and so on of over 800, actually 850 companies that have been coming out, and we've automated it into understanding what they are talking about to see whether we are early in the stage of supply chains moving or late. Okay? And what we found out is quite interesting, that over the last several quarters, when we look at tech, industrials, and consumer discretionary, the blue line is what you need to see. From about 10 to 12% of companies, about a year and a half back, more than one third, 37% of companies are actually saying that they are talking about evaluating or looking at shifting supply chains. That's 37 of an entire universe of 850. There are 200 to 300 companies talking about evaluating for a new geography or thinking about moving. That's an opportunity. In that opportunity, where does ASEAN stack up? So 46% of companies actually said they were in the process of evaluating and moving. Of that 46%, nearly half of them mentioned ASEAN either severally or in individual countries that they were thinking about. So ASEAN quite clearly is already on the map. What you need to do is provide facilities and attract companies to come in because they're already thinking about us. Like I said, China has done the marketing for the CLMVT region. Our job is to go and deliver the product. Now, if you dig down within ASEAN, there is another message here, that if you looked at this chart, so quite clearly, more than anybody else, everybody is talking about Vietnam. That message is already in the numbers. But what we are starting to see is people thinking about places like Cambodia, which was not talked about 2 years back. So clearly, there's a thinking that yes, you need to go to ASEAN. When people think about moving a supply chain to ASEAN, what's the first name that comes to mind? It is Vietnam. What we need to go is beyond. Now, why is Vietnam so front and center? Why are Chinese companies pouring investments at the rate of 34% more year over year? I don't think this is a story about infrastructure. I don't think this is a story about Samsung. But there's one metric where Vietnam stands out against almost any country in the world, matching only China, and that's education. So the OECD does a survey every year which takes test scores on science, reading, and mathematics. Okay? And these scores are marked to scale. Generally speaking, you'll see that education scores go up with per capita GDP. And when you compare it to per capita GDP, the biggest outlier anywhere in the world is up here. That's Vietnam. Vietnamese students score better on education than anyone at that per capita GDP. In absolute scores, they are matched till about $12,000 per capita GDP. They are matched only by China. And if you go further, I think the only other countries that come to that scale are going to be Singapore, Japan, and the US. All are very developed countries. So you actually have a pool, and a sizable pool. It's a country with 94 million population, sizable pool of high-quality education. So if there's message number one, build a high-performance education system. Message number two, of course, is that having young people helps, right? Vietnam, if you look at this, this is median population. You'll see that other countries that we talk about in this region stack up really, really well. Laos is here, and Cambodia is here. As you go forward, you'll see Vietnam is about middle of the pack, but it has a larger population. Thailand does not look so good on this, and this perhaps is going to be a disadvantage as you go forward, and you have to think of additional strategies. But if I go back, there's not much you can do about having young population today. It takes a generation to change. But what you can do is skill your population really, really quickly. And sometimes, if you have a smaller population, smaller countries have an advantage that they can make that change fast. If you took a country like Indonesia, with 250 million people, relatively young population, and you wanted to change the education system, it would take you 20 years, even if you started today. In other countries, you can do it quicker, and that's actually message number two. Go ahead and build a strong education system. Right? The next reason why I think there is an opportunity beyond just Vietnam is actually because of Vietnam's own success. If you look at this chart, this is exports to GDP. Vietnam has hit a point where exports to GDP are about 100%. What does this do? Externally and internally. Externally, what it means is that your economy or your economic growth after a point starts to get influenced by factors outside of your own country, not in your own control. Because if you have a slowdown in the US, it impacts you. The second, in a broader nature, is that you start to see what I would describe as imbalances building up in the economy, because one side of the economy is growing fast and becoming very strong. And second, from a producer's point of view, I think there is some risk that they start to worry about having all of their eggs in one basket. So I think from a supply chain point of view, Vietnam is a success story. We think there's an opportunity for other countries. Now let's talk about, when I go seeking another country, what is someone who's putting up a facility looking for? Okay. The American Chamber of Commerce has actually done a bunch of different work, and they do a survey every year called the ASEAN Business Outlook Survey, which talks to about 200-odd companies operating in every one of these countries and ask them what they are looking for. Number one, what do they look for? 3, 4, 5 years back, this chart would have infrastructure as number one. So when they're looking to expand their operations in ASEAN, the first thing that they're talking about is anti-corruption measures. Second is transparency. Third is good governance. Okay? All of these are soft infrastructure. It's not hard infrastructure. So message number one is soft infrastructure matters. And I started out by saying that from a supply side, everybody's looking for education. The second, on a policymaker side, they are looking for things like anti-corruption and transparency. Okay. Now, if you move forward and see, in 2018, last year, when a company wanted to expand in their current location, and again, the sample of this being the American Chamber of Commerce, the sample is a US company, so this is a slightly US-centric way of thinking. You'll see that 50% of them were talking about growth of the domestic market. How good is the local economy? Is there a middle class? How good is the middle class? This was last year. What's happened over the last 12 months is things like trade wars and a focus on supply chains rather than demand has changed this completely. If you actually look at what they are saying this year, 70% of companies are saying that one of the most important things for them in making a decision to expand in a given location within ASEAN is improvement in intellectual property protection, number one. It's vastly ahead of even infrastructure. And if you look at things like the middle class and consumers are down to number 5. So there is a message here that what's happened because of tariffs, what's happened because of trade issues is changing the thinking of producers, less about the domestic market and more about global sourcing. As you go to think about global sourcing, what you think about is how do I protect my intellectual property rights? Okay? And this is an area that some countries are better than others. You're actually seeing, if you looked at data, you'll actually see that people wanting to talk about Thailand or Malaysia has increased compared to 2 years back. Indonesia seems to be slowing down because it doesn't rank well on this. So if we move forward, I think I'd want to close out here. I recognize that I'm running out of time. If we move forward and we had to take some messages, the messages across the board are, one, this is a once-in-20-year opportunity. You have to seize the opportunity because it will be tougher afterwards if someone else gets in. That's number one. Second, what matters is thinking in terms of supply chains, and companies drive supply chains, not countries. Third, ASEAN is already on the map. It's time to seize the moment because people are already thinking about ASEAN. Fourth, clearly in the CLMVT region and indeed in the world, Vietnam is a success story. The question is to stand on the shoulders of this success story and move forward because I think a Vietnam +1 strategy was going to become important as we go forward. Lastly, what matters is soft infrastructure. A highly educated and skilled workforce is what policymakers can think about. That's number one. Second, what also matters is legal system and intellectual property rather than just thinking about how big a domestic market there was, which was very 2010 to 2012 thinking. Before I wind up, I actually talk about two things. The first is what I think about is the role of Thailand as this develops. So Thailand clearly has been a beneficiary in the new term, in the new tariff environment. But as we go forward, I think there are two roles from Thailand. One, of course, is a place to source, a part of the hub. But two, the second part of the hub is to think about the fact that Thailand is actually a very large economy relative to its neighbors, right? Over the last 10 years, you've actually seen a build-up of about 80, little less than 100, 80 to 90 billion dollars in the balance of payments in Thailand. You run a 6-7% current account surplus. And that build-up becomes the opportunity to become the center of a hub because rather than an American or any other firm who doesn't know the region well, Thailand, I think, is uniquely positioned actually to foster, partner the development of the entire CLMVT region. As people are going, Thailand has the infrastructure, it actually has the skill set. So number one is when we think about FDI, we actually think about FDI coming in. As I discovered in January, Thailand is unique among countries in ASEAN where the Investment Promotion Board actually thinks about both incoming and outgoing FDI. So I think that's advantage number one. and Thailand, therefore, is both sourcing and as a hub. The last point I want to make before I wind up is a little bit of a cautionary tale. So what happens if CLMVT is successful? Money pours in. That's excellent. Can these countries actually absorb money? So if you look at this, this is a little picture of money supply in each of these countries. Again, you'll see that the total broad money in Thailand is about 620 billion. Vietnam is about 376. Other countries are really, really small. Right? So what the last row of this is to say that if you had $1 billion of inflow, what would it do to money supply in the country? Right? If you had $1 billion of inflow, it would make nearly no difference. Thailand could absorb it really easily. Vietnam could absorb it really easily. But $1 billion would actually make a difference of about 4 or 5% to the entire monetary base in a country like Cambodia. This isn't meant to say that the country can't absorb money, but as money comes in, the challenges are for the central bank and so on in terms of managing how that money comes in become paramount. There is an example that I want to give why I've put this slide, because when I look at the slide of Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, it reminds me a lot of the situation in Vietnam back in 2004, 2005. Back in 2004, 2005, everybody started to come to Vietnam. Money poured in, almost exactly like we think the opportunity in other countries is now. So what happened then? In Vietnam, in 2005, the monetary base was only about $41 billion. Same chart, $1 billion made a difference about 2.5% to the overall money supply. 2005, Vietnam got in money. By 2007, inflation hit 20%. Credit growth hit 50%. You had runaway property prices, and you had to tighten it so much that it took 3, 4, 5 years for actually the economy to come back to the old level of growth and be able to absorb it. So if countries are going out and seeking to grow from investments, the message is look at the other side and deepen the pools that are able to receive this money, or think about the money supply implications. Otherwise, you're going to have risks like property prices and inflation, which are actually detrimental and will slow down the entire process. And with that, I'll actually wrap up what I have to say. Thank you very much.